to a special edition of the Darden Admissions Podcast. I'm your host, Brent Twitty, and you are listening to a new episode. On this episode of the podcast, we resume our office hours faculty spotlight with a conversation with Ed Freeman. Ed is a member of the Strategy, Ethics, and Entrepreneurship faculty. He is the Olson Professor of Business Administration here at the Darden School of Business, and he's also the Academic Director for Darden's Institute for Business and Society. He's a very busy guy who's very generous to take some time out of his schedule to talk more about his background, how he came to Darden, the work that he has done on stakeholder theory. As you may know, Ed really founded that idea, and so it was a pleasure to catch up with him and talk more about the work that he has been doing and the traction that stakeholder theory has gained in the marketplace over the past 40 years. This is a great conversation for anyone considering Darden, any format. This is essential listening. So I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. This is my interview, Professor Ed Freeman. Ed, tell us your story. Who are you and what's your background?
Well, I don't know how much you want to know. I did a PhD in philosophy. And so I was looking around for something to do because there were no jobs for people with PhDs in philosophy. I had grown up on a dirt farm in Georgia, and I was very young. I was in my early 20s. And a guy on my dissertation committee said, you're interested, do a postdoc. And I thought, postdoc, good. I could make money at that. And I said, where? And he said, Pittsburgh, at a great philosophy department. I said, but you're interested in decision-making and that stuff. You should go to Wharton. And honest to God, I said, what's Wharton? I'd never heard of it. I didn't know anything about it. This would have been 1975 or so. And he said it's a business school. And I didn't know anything about that. I'm thinking maybe it's typing in shorthand, I'm literally clueless. And I said, is it a good one? And he said, yeah, it's one of the best. One of the best. I said, yeah, okay. Where is it? Because I didn't know. And he said, Philadelphia, University of Pennsylvania. I was at Washington University in St. Louis. And I said, well, I might be interested because my girlfriend was going to city planning school at Penn. And so I went to Wharton for an interview, got hired in a research position, was very lucky that one day, about a year or so in, my boss comes to me and said, you've thought about a lot of stuff. You want to take this stakeholder idea, see if you can do something with it, because no one's ever really done much with it. And I thought, yeah, I can maybe do something with it. And so that led to, writing papers and a book and teaching and moving to the faculty at Wharton. And that really gave me a pretty good start. Wharton wasn't the place for me. I didn't do the sort of research that a lot of people did there. University of Minnesota came along and offered me tenure, which was a big deal for academics. I was still pretty young. And so I moved to Minnesota. We spent 3 winters there. I knew some people at Darden. Again, Minnesota was the sort of place, again, I'm not going to diss either of those 2 great institutions, but, I cared about teaching and cared about students, and that was not their top priority. I think that's the nicest way I've ever said it. And I came to Darden, and the students were in the center. And I thought the second class I saw, first one wasn't very good, but the second class I saw, I thought, this is a place I want to teach. And I've been here 35 years. I think I've written 35 or 40 books. I don't really know, and a couple of hundred papers, and have had thousands of students. And tried to spread the stakeholder idea around the world. Not many people cared for the first 15 or 20 years, and they seem to care now. So that's been a very positive thing. I've often said, Brett, I have the best job in the world, and the reason I have the best job in the world is we have the best students. best here students who come, who want to work, who know that ethics is important. And, I can't imagine a better gig, quite honestly. That's probably more than you wanted to know, but.
All good. I want to go back a little ways, though. You have a PhD in philosophy. I was watching your TEDx Charlottesville talk, and you relayed this joke that your dad had shared with you that, well, that's good. They just opened a lot of philosophy factories out by the highway.
I mean, he didn't actually say that. I made that up, but I thought it was a pretty good joke.
A good joke.
It was a good joke. What the actual story was. My brother-in-law, who did an undergrad degree in philosophy, my father-in-law allegedly said, "What are you going to do? Open a philosophy store?" But look, philosophy just taught me how to think. That's all. And the only reason I've been able to make a contribution to management theory with developing the stakeholder idea, is because I didn't know this was supposed to be controversial. I thought the idea that what businesses do is they create value and sometimes destroy it, but they try to create value for customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and the people with the money. As I'm trying to figure out what this business thing is, that became pretty clear to me that that's what they did. And I didn't realize that was some radical idea. I thought it was common sense. So when I wrote this book that's now got, 45,000 academic citations, I thought nobody, this is common sense. This is kind of a thing that need to write it, but, so what? My wife read it. By this time, my wife was the girlfriend. So that we've been married for 44 years. So that part of the Wharton journey worked out. By this time, Maureen has gone back to get her MBA at Wharton. And so she reads the draft of this and goes, well, honey, I don't know that you're going to be able to make a living at this. This is just too much common sense, So that turned out okay too. I didn't even think the stakeholder idea was the most interesting idea in the book. I thought the most interesting idea was the idea that companies have a purpose, that rather than say what a lot of consultants like Peter Drucker and others have said, what business are you in? There was a lot of consulting companies from McKinsey, BCG, Bain. They all, were sort of famous for saying, what business are you in? Well, we're in the can business. No, you're in the container business. And there's a whole lot of stuff around that. And I thought the most interesting idea in the book was that's not the best question. The best question is, what do you stand for? What do you stand for will determine what business you're in. Or there should be a connection between those things. Now, again, it's pretty straightforward that purpose matters to strategy. In the early 80s, that was not an accepted idea. And so when I wrote about this, something I called enterprise strategy, trying to speak to people who did strategy, there was yet one more big yawn. So I think I'm pretty good at producing. Somebody said, well, you're always way ahead of your time. Well, that may be, but I it's still a little tricky to write stuff and people go, yeah, not really. And especially to write it where I'm saying, look, I didn't make this stuff up. This is how I see what's going on in business and the people I talk to, which is, I talk to thousands of business people pretty much every year. And I don't know enough to make stuff up. I'm old now, but still doing the same thing, and still doing the same thing in part because of the energy I get from our students.
Well, I want to pick up on something that's come up in the Q&A and was in the advanced questions. So you published Stakeholder Theory book that you're referencing in the early 80s, I think 84.
Yeah.
And so here we are, 2021, it's a sort of arc of time. When you published it initially, this yawn, and here we are, 2021, Stakeholder Theory, very in vogue. Business Roundtables come along and said, this is the framework. What is it like? You're talking almost 40 years of time. What has changed so significantly?
Well, I just a quick story. One of the first papers was a paper called Stakeholder Management, which we wrote. Jim Emsoff, my boss and mentor, we wrote it in 1977. I just found an old copy of it, and we sent it to a journal to be listed. In those days, you had to get papers listed because there's no internet, working papers. So the editor called and says, yeah, we're going to list your paper, no problem, but there's a horrible typo in the title. And I said, what? And he said, well, it says something stakeholder management. We know you mean stockholder, but we can change it. Don't worry. And I said, please don't. So when you start there, and then the Business Roundtable comes out and says, hey, the days of shareholder primacy are over. That announcement failed. Nobody caught my fist kind of pumping in the air on camera. Now, maybe I had a little to do with that. Not with the roundtable. This was a time. At one point, I was an advisor to the roundtable, but I haven't been for the past few years. But the statement was very compatible with pretty much everything I had written. And the BlackRock CEO, Larry Fink, who came out and said, look, if we're going to invest in you, you need a purpose. You need to think about your stakeholders and how you create value. And you need to worry about societal issues. Why did all this happen? Look, I really think the turning point was the global financial crisis. You're trying to maximize shareholder value, and you lever up 30-1, and that it doesn't take a genius to figure out that's real easy to come undone. And it did. And so I think there was a realization much broader that that's not going to work. Furthermore, if you look at the societal issues, and here just in the US, but they're literally similar issues all over the world, the violence between ethnic groups, or in US, the police violence around things like George Floyd. If you look at the inequality, the inequality gap, and that inequality gap is true all over the world. It has been increasing all over the world. And if you, and in many cases, it's racial or ethnic. If you look at gender discrimination and how that works, and you think about now there's no place to hide because everybody's got an iPhone, and you can see the effects of all this stuff. I think nobody's trying to, and then you put a pandemic on top of that. I haven't heard anybody argue, hey, you know how we're going to get out of this? We are going to double down on shareholder value. I mean, it's not going to work. Business is a societal institution. It's an important one. And it has to take its place in society as dealing with these big issues. It doesn't have to, every business doesn't have to deal with everything, but business people have to understand what are the societal issues that affect it that it can do something about. And so rather than just think about market forces, every business has to think about market forces. Yes, that's important. And societal forces. And you can't do that in the shareholder primacy model. So I think the people said, well, this stakeholder thing seems like a pretty good framework to think about this. And there are forces like the World Economic Forum and others that have tried to push this stuff along as well. But it's been pretty amazing, quite honestly, to watch the world sort of come around to something I thought was blindingly obvious 40 years ago.
I want to stay with this idea of sort of economic inequity, because there is a lot of conversation right now about capitalism and whether or not capitalism can actually lift all people. The Churchill quote about capitalism is terrible until you think about all the other sort of economic systems, and then maybe it doesn't look so bad. But we are in this moment where capitalism feels very, very challenging to kind of think about. How do you make it equitable?
Yeah. So a couple of things. First of all, the father of capitalism, Adam Smith, never used the word. You can't find it in any of his writings. And he had two important books, The Wealth of Nations, but he also wrote a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, in which Adam Smith lays out that if people in business don't have a sense of justice, markets don't work very well. And he understood that way back in the 18th century. And the person we get the word capitalism from is Marx. And that's a little bit like, having the enemy, design the uniform of the other team, right? So capitalism has a lot of, it's got a big, long train of baggage behind it. So I like to think about business, and you can use capitalism if you want to. I kind of like stakeholder capitalism, but in thinking about business, and there've been lots of proposals for reform over the last 10 years. I've made some. A lot of people have made some. There's Conscious Capitalism, a book by two friends of mine, John Mackey and Raj Sisodia, which is great if you haven't read that, and a group called Conscious Capitalism Inc. I'm actually missing the board meeting right now to talk to all of you. And there's inclusive capitalism, there's connected capitalism, there's capitalism 2.0, maybe 3.0. There's even Wall Street's hitting into the act with impact investing and ESG, renewed interest in old ideas like corporate social responsibility, corporate philanthropy, corporate sustainability, etc. And in the waning days of the Obama administration, I was invited to the White House to be a part of a meeting run by Tom Perez, who was the Secretary of Labor, and then head of the Democratic Party the last 4 years. And Tom's idea was, of course, everybody thought they were going to be there another 4 years, which turned out not to be true. But his thought was, what can government do to sort of speed up these reforms, or at least not screw them up? And the other question he had was kind of what's the right brand? Now, the Department of Labor was pretty much interested in kind of putting employees at the center, right, and having good jobs. My own view of that was, if you put any one stakeholder at the center, the world might be better if you put employees at the center, but it's not gonna, it's still gonna be screwed up, right? So I sat there at this meeting. There were 40 or 50 people, and these were the people who were the proponents of these ideas. So it was a pretty elite group. I felt like a total imposter, and I just thought, I'm not sure this is the right question. I think it might be a better question to ask, what are the 4 or 5 really critical ideas that whatever the brand is, whatever the final reforms are, you got to deal with these 4 or 5 ideas. And so Bobby Parmar, who's one of my colleagues here at Darden, and a professor the students absolutely cherish, and Kirsten Martin, who's a former doctoral student here and is a chaired professor at Notre Dame now, we decided to write a book. And the book is called The Power of And, Responsible Business Without Trade-offs. And the basic idea here is that, look, you can't substitute just think about purpose. It's purpose and profits. And most of the conversations, one or the other, so it's 5 ideas: purpose and profits, stakeholders and shareholders, thinking about business as a societal institution and a market institution, thinking about people as fully grown-up human beings, not just self-interested economic maximizers, and thinking about ethics and business. And the argument is, whatever the reforms are, you got to deal with these 5 things. And what we do in The Power of And is give 100 or so examples of how companies are doing this. I am extremely optimistic that there is a revolution going on in the way that we think about business. It's a conceptual revolution, and business people are changing the world. One of the nice things about teaching here is that we don't spend any time trying to convince students that ethics is important. If you don't think ethics is important in business, you probably shouldn't come here. And a lot of our students are trying to start and design businesses that deal with those sort of five ands there. I don't know if that makes any sense to you, Brett, but
totally.
The book came out in 2020, right just in time for the pandemic. And therefore, all it turns out, I was happy to learn this, all business books in 2020 fell with a big thud from the press. So I may have to figure out yet another way to write about this argument.
There's still time. We have time to read still. And I appreciate you walking through all of that. And so one of the things I want to pick up on, it's come up here in the Q&A, is, all right, we live in this time. Some of the most interesting ethical questions seem to be bubbling kind of around technology and how quickly technology is changing. There's a question in the Q&A of like stakeholder theory in this like hyper digital age. How if you were a tech company or you look at some of these tech issues that are coming along, how does stakeholder theory help us understand these things? Yeah,
that's a great question. Beetle, I think, who asked it. Again, I think the tech companies have to do a much better job of engaging with their stakeholders, engaging in the sense so that they're not taken by surprise when you have the effects that you have, and you kind of face into those. There's some effects of things that you can't predict. But if you're engaged with your customers and suppliers and your employees and the communities, you're going to have a much better idea about how these things are going to affect you. And so the idea of the lone entrepreneur sitting in Silicon Valley with a big pile of money from a VC, figuring out how to create this science fiction world, I think doesn't work very well. Another one of my professors or colleagues who the students love, Sarah Sarasvathy, has a really different idea called effectuation about how businesses actually work. That you start with the relationships that you have. And I think even more that we need to think about entrepreneurship not just as the unicorns, but as how we create businesses that make our lives better, sort of across the technological spectrum. And the technology is a means. Now, has the technology in some sense outstripped our ability to think about ethics? I think the answer to that is yeah, and that's a dangerous thing. We talk about that in our ethics class. Last year, I used a short story called I, Robot, which is an Isaac Asimov story about a robot who dreams. And what do you do about that? We also do a real case on self-driving cars and the complexities of those things. We've got to get better in society at having conversations about stuff that, we don't know what the consequences are. For instance, I had a lot of conversations with my grandmother about ethics. She was a very important figure to me. We had no conversations about whether or not safe abortion on demand was right or wrong. Why? It just wasn't feasible. I mean, nobody thought about that. The technology didn't exist. We had no conversations about, should I be able to download somebody else's songs from a point-to-point network? We had no conversations about artificial intelligence. We had no conversations about end-of-life technology and where life ends. And technology means it hasn't invalidated what I learned from my grandmother. It's just made those conversations about how do we apply that? Do we need to change some of those values, or do we need to change some of the technologies? It's made those conversations urgent. And the tension is that urgent conversations in a society where the sort of civic conversation, the political conversation is broken, are very hard to do. And that's one of the greatest challenges for business people. How do they take a role in those conversations, especially in a world in which the dominant story of business is not necessarily stakeholder oriented. The dominant story of business throughout the world is, look, it's just about the money. It's a story I've called the business sucks story. And there are a lot of ways to illustrate this, but one way would be to say, look, if I were to say to you, Brett, that I got a real ethics issue we got to deal with, I would ask the participants here, how many of you just thought, oh, he wants to tell us about somebody who invented something really cool that makes our lives better? My guess is no one thought about that, but come on. I mean, what you thought about was, something terrible's happened. There's somebody screwed up, right? But, if business gets the credit for the bad stuff, and they should take responsibility for that, they need credit for the good stuff too. And so I think making this conversation come alive about ethics in business, not as a set of thou shalt nots. What we try and do in our ethics core courses here is say to the students, what we want you to do is to figure out a set of questions that you want to ask about all of these issues. And it doesn't have to be the same set of questions that I use. I'll tell you the ones I do, but that's your task here. And actually, that's the final exam in ethics. And we tell people that pretty much the first day. That doesn't mean it's easy. It just means no surprise.
Well, Ed, one of the things you talked about really compellingly here is the ethical emphasis at Darden. It's in the core curriculum in the first year. And one of the sort of lines of questioning that's coming up in the Q&A is, what's unique about Darden? Where did this come from, this sort of ethical emphasis? Because some people, you say business ethics and they think it's oxymoronic, to your point about
oxymoron. Must be a short course. I didn't know business had any. Mm-hmm. I was in a bar in Copenhagen and somebody asked me what I did. I said, I teach business ethics. A theoretical subject isn't it? I think I've heard them all, and that's part of the problem. As long as the joke is there, we got work to do. Darden Darden was started. Colgate Darden himself was a former governor of Virginia. Had a very strong stand in his life about ethics. I never met him. He was passed long before I did, but I did meet his widow, Miss Connie, when I came here many years ago. She was about 200 years old, I think, but she was terrific and told me about those things. In the 1960s, long before anybody else did this, the Olson family, who started the Chesapeake Company, gave us a very generous grant to start the Olson Center for Applied Ethics, to put ethics and business together. So by the time I came in the mid 80s, there'd been a 20-year history of people putting together business and ethics. So I thought I'd died and gone to heaven, because I found a place that you weren't constantly arguing, hey, wait, ethics is important. Ethics was seen in those days as one of the background disciplines of business. And we started a required graded core first year course. We often will teach together joint classes with marketing or accounting or strategy or finance or quantitative analysis or communications. That's the sort of thing that happens at Darden much more than it does at other schools. Well, the two other schools I taught at, it never happened, but so it's much more here. And we have, I would say, in addition to the required course, a number of electives that get people to, deal with issues like the technology question, to deal with things like where are the hard cases that we need to figure out what to do. And we're very lucky to have as a colleague a woman, Mary Gentili. Mary has pioneered a technique called giving voice to values. And Mary's idea here, she for many years at the Harvard Business School, and then she creates this whole approach called giving voice to values that says, look, a lot of times we know the right thing to do, but we got to figure out how to have the courage, how to do the right thing when we know the right thing. And Mary's actually very famous around the world in ethics for helping companies do those things. And she does a course here and is a colleague here at Darden for that. So again, we don't see ethics as separate from business. We see it as kind of built in. Even our finance folks often talk about stakeholders. Our accounting faculty talks about sustainability. Our operations faculty does work on sustainable supply chain. And so for us, it's sort of throughout the curriculum because it's a background discipline. We have an institute called the Institute for Business in Society. And we mean that we have to see business as in society. And we sponsor lots of research projects and some things for students as well for that. So once again, this is why I claimed earlier I had the best job in the world. Ethics is serious. In fact, last year, some students decided they wanted to start a business ethics club. We have 130 students in the business ethics club. I just did a session last week called Ethics 2.0, and there's no credit. It's a series of seminars that the students organized because they wanted to do more ethics. Ethics 1.0 is the required course. Ethics 2.0 is this student or organized thing. Now, I just don't know. I've taught at probably almost every business school in the world at some level, and having students organize an ethics 2.0 from their faculty is, well, I just haven't seen it anywhere else. And that's something that, again, makes my job best in the world.
Well, we've had the founder of the Business Ethics at Darden Club on the podcast, our admissions podcast, Experience Darden, and see my colleague Maggie Dodson's also shared a blog post about that.
Okay, great.
Yeah, 130 students. I didn't realize that was their membership.
Well, I think that's right. Pranav may know more about it than I do, but Pranav Dalmia and some other students were the founders of this.
Well, good question here in the Q&A about
yeah, there are, by the way, lots of great questions. Yeah. I hope I get a chance to have a lot of these folks as students.
Yeah, lots and lots and lots of questions, which I think says a lot about people's engagement with what you're talking about. How do we create policies, though, that incentivize companies to think about, purpose in ethics? Is there a way to create a framework here?
So I actually think framing things as the need to incentivize people can be misleading. One of the things we know from research is if-then incentives. If you do this, then you get that. Work in very particular circumstances when the task is boring and repetitive and it's clear what the answer is. Where you don't know what those things are, so you need to understand your own cognitive ability and kind of how that works. Those if-then incentives actually cause you to perform worse. What works in those cases is giving people a sense of autonomy, a sense of mastery and mastering their environment, and a sense of purpose. And so I would say, how can we encourage companies to develop their sense of purpose? Now, one of the ways to do that is just get the incentive crap out of the way. So for instance, a lot of people have an incentive to manage earnings. Why? Because they do quarterly calls. They do quarterly calls that I've missed. A CEO friend of mine missed his quarterly expectations by 2 cents, and his stock got hammered by 40%. That's an incentive that gets in the way. This actually was a high performance, rather a high purpose company. Now they didn't waver from their purpose, but the incentive was to do that. So if we can just get the disincentives out of the way, I would really be happy. Entrepreneurs don't start a business to make as much money as they can. Entrepreneurs start a business because they're on fire about something. Steve Jobs and Bill Gates on fire about the personal computer revolution. John Mackey on fire about getting people healthy through food with Whole Foods. Friend of mine who runs a little investment company in Northern Virginia called The Motley Fool, Tom and Dave Gardner, on fire about helping make the world better investors. Entrepreneurs are on fire about stuff. Now, look, of course you got to make money. I'm not arguing money is not important, but it's not what comes first. It's profits, but it's purpose. Without purpose, I don't think anybody wants on their tombstone made some profits. Most people want to do something so they change the world. That's what business is about. That's what the opportunity in business is about, is to figure out how to change the world. We have to be the generations, because there's more than one of us here. I'm old, I'm almost done. But, so let me say, you have to be the generation makes business better. You have to be the generation that figures out a capitalism or a system of business that makes that's you want your kids to work in. Is there stuff that could be done? Sure. Look, I think the capital markets, the regulations around the capital markets, where you could buy a company, bust it up, just if the stock went down. I think we have to rethink those. We might have to rethink who has voting rights and those kinds of things. I don't have the answer, and I think it's dangerous. And the academics who say there's one answer for all businesses are actually kind of dangerous. I'm not in favor of a kind of stakeholder reporting system, as has been implemented in some parts of the EU, has been proposed in the US, or something like mandatory percentage go to CSR, as is the law in India. I think there are too many easy ways around those things, and even though the laws may mean well, there are too many consequences which we can't understand, and ultimately too many abuses.
Well, Ed, I want to come back to this idea of businesses and purpose, particularly since you look at what's, being asked of business leaders and businesses these days. People want to know how they think about the world, how they view the world. What are your values as world events happen? And I think if you go back in time, businesses could perhaps step away from that and be like, oh, we don't have a perspective on that thing, or you might not hear as much from them. The world has changed, though. How do you think about all of this? Are you surprised by this movement at all?
No. Again, it was pretty easy to see that coming a long time ago, because just open your eyes to the world. And you had to open your eyes broader than just the U.S. business system, where a lot of people ignored it. And I think that's what's happened. That's in part driven by the internet, in part driven by the fact that lots of people have iPhones or cell phones. And so I think that's a really good movement, a really good thing that's happened and will continue to grow. There's some downsides to it. The downsides to it is people acting on information that's kind of bull or not real. There are downsides to it by people saying, well, I've done my research. Well, wait a minute. No, you haven't. You just read some articles by a couple of people on the internet that you agree with. That's not doing research. So one of the things that we have to do in schools is and especially in MBA schools, we have to sort of ratchet down on critical thinking. We do a course, Bobby Palmer and I do a course called Critical and Creative Thinking. Both of those things are important. If we can't sort out the wheat from the chaff in critical terms, then what we create will be questionable. On the other hand, if we don't think through pretty clearly how we're going to increase our creative imagination, look, let's be honest. The robots are going to do everything else. All we got as human beings is our creativity, So trying to figure out how you build that creative muscle. And again, I'm very proud of Darden. I've been able to, and some of us have been able to teach courses on ethics in literature, on ethics in theater, even did one on ethics in music once. We have a faculty student band. The creative arts are kind of alive here in a way, and I hope they're going to grow, because that creative muscle, if you don't use it, it will atrophy. And we know from research that, for instance, if you play music 15 minutes a day, it'll change your brain. Change your brain so that you can literally be more be more creative. And that's what we need. We need many, many more creative entrepreneurs experimenting with companies that will help solve things like global warming and inequality, and poverty, and make money doing so.
Well, I want to pick up on a couple of things that you've accomplished recently, in addition to the books that you've published. You had a documentary come out not so long ago, Fishing with Dynamite. How did you decide this is the right time to make a movie?
Well, I didn't. Bobby Parmar, who's my young colleague, who I've known for many years, said, if we really want to have an impact, we got to talk to people other than just business school students. And then he said, I said, yeah, that's right. He said, so let's make a movie. And I went, yeah, right. I mean, but he managed to convince a guy, who had won an Academy Award for documentaries to do it. So we made this movie called Fishing with Dynamite. It looks at primarily three companies. Luke's Lobster, which is a little startup that's now grown like crazy. The Container Store, it's about $1 billion company. And Eastman Chemical, that's a multi-billion-dollar company. And a lot of people who we knew who, are sort of pundits, business thinkers, et cetera, to look at the arguments for shareholder primacy versus stakeholder capitalism. Movies released, it's on, I think it's on iTunes, it's on Amazon, et cetera. It won some award at a film festival here, and we've spent a lot of time doing it. If you come to Darden, you'll be forced to see it in first year ethics. But it's a good vehicle for discussion, I think. And Bobby was right. I was not so gung ho on making the movie, but as usual, if you listen to people you work with, they radically improve your ideas. So he gets the credit absolutely for that. And Paul Wagner, who's the director.
And you have a podcast now?
Podcast. So this one again comes from, not from me. I don't have any good ideas. It comes from my son, Ben, who's 35. He lives in Nashville, where I'm going next week. And he's a musician and a writer. And he said to me, Dad, if you want people if you want to broaden this idea of stakeholder thinking, to my generation, you better do a podcast. And so he and I created a company called Stakeholder Media, and we started doing something called the Stakeholder Podcast. And I'm thinking, I could do kind of one of these a month. That'd be fine. And he says, no, we're going to do one a week. So there are about 65 of these up now. It's on all the podcast platforms. You'd have to put in the Stakeholder Podcast or the Stakeholder Podcast with Ed Freeman. And, it's really great. We've gotten lots of, we do it just as a conversation, not a set of questions or anything. And there's some CEOs, there's some professors at Darden, professors around the world. The good thing about being 69 is a lot of people. I've found that I actually enjoy being on your side of the mic, Brett. I've always been on this side where I'm being interviewed or I'm the one making the presentation or I'm talking about my ideas. Gee, what a pleasure it is to be on the other side and think about that. So it's been a lot of fun. And And there's a fair amount of pressure. Ben, my son, is the producer. And so we're trying to, last week we had Charles Hampton Turner on. Charles is a legend in management consulting, et cetera. And I think the week before we had a guy, Dean Kremeyer, who's the chief of staff at Darden. So if you look through those, you'll see a fair number of people with Darden affiliations. And if you want to find out more about the school, that's a pretty good source.
Well, Ed, I imagine you talk to business leaders all the time and they say, look, here's where we are with our company. Here's where I'd like to get. How do we create space for this conversation? What are things that we can, kind of create this momentum around changing the conversation within the business?
Well, it's not, there's no formula. Given, if I just think for a minute, there are other frameworks, but if I think for a minute about the framework in the Power of And, there are at least 5 ways you can start this. Many companies need to start with the idea of purpose, to kind of rediscover their purpose. I worked with a company recently, pretty large international company, and the kicker was, how many people ever had an argument about what our old purpose meant, or used the old purpose statement as a way to do something? And the answer was no one. So it was just words. Whereas what they thought they ought to move towards was created a great deal of tension in the company, and that was good. Some companies can't start with that. I remember a CEO who I grew to like very much. His team wanted to start with, okay, when he took over, what are the new values? What are we going to do? What are the new values? And he said, look, we got to make this a kick-ass place to work, and we got to give great customer service, and we don't do either of those right now. So let's work on that. And when we get to there, then we can talk about what we stand for. So for him, the way into this was thinking about the systems and processes, because purpose doesn't live in the purpose statement. It lives in the systems and processes. If we were to say, as we do, the Darden School stands for, I don't remember exactly what the words are, but my version of it is developing responsible leaders to make the world a better place. And we had no conversations about that, about the systems and processes that support that. It wouldn't be worth the paper it's printed on. So it's digging into the systems and processes that work sometimes. Sometimes companies kind of got the purpose right, but they really screw up how they interact with stakeholders. They just aren't engaged enough, or they're engaged from the standpoint of, we know what they want. Well, they need to start there. Sometimes companies have had serious ethical breaches, and they need to start there. And sometimes companies have issues where they haven't paid enough attention to communities, to society, and they need to start there. So I think it depends on the problem the company's trying to solve. This is why it's hard to say there's a kind of one size fits all for everybody to move to stakeholder capitalism, because not all companies are alike. Not all companies are in the same place. They don't all measure how they're doing with stakeholders in the same way. And all that's great. That's why business is so terrific. There's so much variation, so much diversity.
Well, Ed, you mentioned creativity. You're a big music fan, and you play music. Tell us a little bit more about that. Are there any artists you particularly love? Any records you particularly love?
Yeah, well, one of my questions I use on the podcast a lot is, you're going to a desert island, you only got 5 records. what five are there? Thank God nobody's asked me my five yet, but I actually have them. It's clear that it's live at Fillmore East with the Allman Brothers. That's the best live rock and roll album ever. It's live at the Royal with B.B. King, which is the best live blues album ever. It's Something by Bob Marley. Legends will do, but there might be a better Bob Marley album. It's Yo-Yo Ma playing the Bach cello concertos, which is the most beautiful piece of music I've one of the most beautiful pieces of music I've ever heard. And it's Miles Davis Kind of Blue. So I listen to everything from Willie Nelson to hip hop to Bach to the Allman Brothers to my favorite band these days is the Tedeschi Trucks Band. If you don't know them or haven't heard of them, listen to a song called Midnight in Harlem. And it's an absolutely beautiful, beautiful song. And they have a 12-piece full blues band, and Derek Trucks is probably the best guitar player on the planet. So we have fun. We started 2003. So it's been going on almost 20 years. Blues Jam, which is a band with Darden faculty and students. And we always have 2 or 3 students a year. We've had some just incredible musicians and singers over the year. That's been a real privilege to play with. And you want to get to if you want to get to know faculty, play music with them. You want to get to know students, play music with them. That's a thing that might seem incredibly unusual at other schools, but it's really not unusual here. Darden is a real community. Most of us teach here because we like students. A lot of people, if they weren't at business schools, they'd be in business. If I wasn't at here, I'd be teaching like 8th grade math or something like that. So teaching, even though I would say I've written as much or more than the next guy, probably too much for my own good. Teaching is and being with the students and getting to know them is it. I just spent yesterday with a former student of mine from the class of 91. And he's the CEO of a major manufacturer now. Watching him grow and develop over the last 30 years there's nothing that's more satisfying than having the students come back and tell you about what they're doing.
Well, Ed, one last question for you. Thank you so much for your time and all your incredible insights today. Any final words for our prospective students tuning in here? Anything you'd want them to know about Darden or take with them as they go forth into the world?
If you don't want to be a part of a community, if what you want is to kind of do your thing, get your MBA and go somewhere else, but not really interact with people and professors and the community of Charlottesville, this is probably not the place for you. If you want to have an intense 2 years that will make you feel alive, this is a terrific place. It's a very, very high energy place, a place that I love. I would never go anywhere else. Again, we've got to be the generations that make business better. That's what it is, and that's kind of what we're about.
And that was my interview with Ed Freeman, a professor here at the Darden School of Business in the Strategy, Ethics, and Entrepreneurship area. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, requests, anything you'd like for us to cover here on the podcast, we're all ears. We can be reached at Darden, that's DARDEN, @virginia.edu. Until next time, stay safe, be well, and thanks for listening.